Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest today. With me is J.C. Glick, who's a retired Army Ranger Lieutenant Colonel. He's a leadership, strategy, and culture advisor, as well as an author and TEDx speaker. Sarah Calmetta, did I get that right? No, I was in trouble. Also known as Sarah the Pivoter, which is easier for me, is founder of Pivot Point, a career transition coach, author, and podcast host. And Scott Mason, also known as the Myth Slayer, is a speaker, podcast host, and coach working with executives and entrepreneurs to magnetize and monetize professional freedom by dislodging toxic myths to ignite the charisma within. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure.
And here is today's scenario. About 5 years ago, I was driving home from Dallas, Texas, when I pulled up to a toll booth in Oklahoma. Being somewhat directionally challenged, I told the attendant that I was turning west, thereby exempting myself from the toll of $2.50. When I reached the turnoff, however, I realized that I needed to go east, but there was no way of getting back to correct my error without a complicated and time-consuming detour. That error remained on my mind, and it seemed proper to mail a check to the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. However, I only seemed to remember that I needed to correct the error when I was in no position to do anything about it. Just last week, I was once again driving back from Dallas. I told the toll booth attendant that on my last trip, I had mistakenly said west when I meant east, and that I wanted to pay double. She told me not to worry about it and waved me through. Did the attendant have the authority to turn down my offer to pay for my previous mistake? Should I have insisted she take the extra fee? What if it would have cost her extra effort to process my double payment? Should I still send a check to the Oklahoma Department of Transportation? And in general, what attitude should we adopt towards small, unintentional errors that might cost more to correct than the loss or damage we originally caused? Floor is open.
You know, when I thought about this, I thought how much better a person you are than I am. Because one, that you recalled, I mean, maybe it's also that you have a better memory as well. Because I don't know that I would have even recalled that. But it's an interesting line where does it exist? Like, hey, I walk out with something underneath my shopping cart that I forgot to put on, you buy $500 worth of groceries and there's a $2, roll of paper towels underneath and you forgot. And then it's like, okay, do I go in? Do I do this? And I think I always do, but I think that there's always this idea of, I'm going to try to pay it forward as well. And I'm going to I know that I'm going to do these things. And I'm not going to right that specific wrong in that moment. But the idea of, I will try to make sure that if somebody else is wrong, I can maybe pay it forward for them.
I think this is a really interesting one because, as your podcast name suggests, it's a gray area. Where do you draw the line? What is considered small? What's considered big? But I think for the most part, businesses, the state of Oklahoma, they have a method to account for instances like this, right? And if we had a line of people that were coming back around to correct this wrong, that might make the system more clogged up, right? Cause delays and have a further impact that was unintentional. And we've talked about that before on your podcast, where we do things with one focus, one intent, one outcome that we are hoping for. But in that process, something else pops up and we have unintended consequences. So I really like, JC, how you brought in that idea of paying it forward. It'll come back around at some other point. You'll have an opportunity to correct it, and it doesn't have to be right now in this moment. What if you went back into the supermarket and there was 50 people in the queue and everyone's stressed because it's the holiday? They don't care about your $2. They want you to get out and leave that space open so that they can process other people who have been waiting. So it's a really subjective question, but I think it's looking at what's the impact that it has now, and how can you pay it forward in the future.
Yeah, I think the two of you are really touching on an interesting point. I mean, I agree with Sarah, JC, that the idea of paying it forward, we often think of in terms of somebody did something nice to me, so I want to pass that on to somebody else. But you're putting a different spin on it, that the error that I committed, there may be impracticalities to correcting it. It may actually make things more difficult it may compound the problem rather than actually correcting the problem. So the idea of looking for some way that I can turn it forward, give something to charity, look for an opportunity to correct someone else's error or forgive someone else's error along the way. It's a really interesting way of looking at it. Scott, what do you think?
I think that we're actually framing this in a way that is unreasonably limited. We're looking at the decision as a series of isolated incidents that may involve the individuals and the decisions that they make and the direct consequences that they have of those decisions, but only within a limited temporal and behavioral framework. There's an interesting book by an ethicist by the name of Richard Shell that I once read. And in that book, he talked about a man who lived in England and would take the train from his suburb into London, I believe, every day. And one day he discovered that if he went in a certain door or got on at a certain stop that was not his usual stop, the person who would take the fare just wouldn't pass by and he wouldn't have to give it to them. And he wouldn't necessarily have to pay whatever fee was in. There was some way that he was able to avoid the fee payment mechanism they had in place that time. And so he did it that once and he got away with it. He was shocked. So then he went back again. And then he went back and again and again and again and again. And actually, he ended up later being given jail time because he ended up owing so much money because of the behavioral shift that one instance of avoiding paying the fee created within him. And so part of what I have as an issue with how this is being framed so far is that it's assuming that the behavioral mechanisms that we have, that the mindset shifts that lead to that particular ethical diversion won't stick. When in fact, human behavior indicates that it usually will. And so when it comes to, in particular, your behavior, you personally, Jonas, I think that there's actually more of an ethical risk than one would be inclined to acknowledge if you viewed it within this temporal lens. Now, the Turnpike employee is a different situation because we don't have facts as to whether they were capable of correcting the problem or not. And so they might have waved you on because they had no capacity to do that. And to me, there's not much of a moral problem if you're asked to do that what's impossible and you can't do it. But if they had the capacity to take that and then they made a choice, actually, particularly in a democratic society like ours that requires money in order to function from people that utilize services, I think that they're committing a moral crime as well. And again, it's the same thing. Where do they stop? The mindset that led them to believe that they have the authority to rob from the people of that state. Revenue, however small, who's to say it won't be $1 next time? $5 next time, 15, and then totaling over the course of their career, hundreds of thousands of dollars is a big deal.
Well, there's this a quote that's attributed to Bernie Madoff, a billion here, a billion there, and soon you're talking about real money. But
yeah,
without the
I hope to get to
cynicism,
that place one day.
Yeah, but your point is a place I really hope we would end up, Scott, because the sages have a teaching that the first time we commit a sin, it's a sin. The second time we commit it, it's permitted. And the third time we commit it, it's an act of virtue. Because as something becomes habit, we become more and more inclined to rationalize that behavior. And the place to catch it is at the beginning, when the stakes are very small, literally and figuratively. If I'm careful about a few pennies, then I'm not going to start down that road where I'm playing fast and loose with much higher stakes.
It seems to me that Scott's point is, it's a little absolutist for me, to be honest with you. I know, I mean, quite honestly, the example you gave is an individual's not habit, but deliberate decision making to see what he could do. I look at it as almost like the telltale heart situation is, I've gotten away with this, let me see how far I can go with it. Whereas when you look at the anecdotal instance where you say, okay, this happened once, you recognize the error, you identify, yeah, I did this, and then you say, okay, well, I can't correct it in this moment, but I can correct it in another moment, right? So you're taking kind of your midbrain and trying to put it up in the prefrontal cortex. You're making deliberate decisions. We're not talking about where, and I don't know that, I'm a believer that one all crap moment doesn't reduce a whole bunch of attaboys. There's kind of there was an old saying in the military, and I won't use the language, but an oh crap moment, that's the nicest I can get it, a race is a whole bunch of attaboys. I don't believe that. I believe that, at our heart, it's what our heart, our mind, if we are deliberately good and we are deliberate and about our intentions, and our intentions are good, then I don't know that slippery slope to behavior is impacted. And you're making a bunch of assumptions too. So let's take it one step further with this whole like, hey, the society, our democratic republic runs on money. Yeah. Who's to say that fund, that $1.50, that $2 doesn't get misappropriated and goes to something illegal? And the government decides to do something illegal that doesn't get found out about it. And I think that's I just think it's a dangerous path to go down, that an act creates the intent for future actions.
Sarah, do you want to respond to that? Because I have a lot I could say. And I intend to.
And once Scott gets rolling, it's hard to stop him. So.
All right.
So immediately my perspective comes in from, I lived in Asia for 13 years. I lived in mainland China, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So coming at it from a cultural perspective, we have different cultures within the United States, within each state. The different generations were taught different rules of ethics, different, right and wrong, depends on, what religion you grew up with and how you were conditioned as a young person being taught about the world around you. And so something that you might be aghast at and think this is horrible, this is wrong, it's a gateway drug to the rest of transgressions. Someone else might look at it, not even bat an eyelid, and wonder what your problem is and why you're making such a big fuss. So it's really hard to have these kind of conversations because, okay, if we want to get into it, like what's the state of Oklahoma look like? What's the, how do we break it down? But we also know that stereotypes are not always true. They exist for a reason. But I can see sides from both arguments. And so to play devil's advocate here, I've certainly made mistakes and had that happen and gone like, oh, this is in my basket. All right, well, I'm late. I'm going to go home anyway. And maybe I never think of it again. Maybe the next time I'm at the store, I, tell them what happened. I can't tell you from every single instance where that's taken place. Does that mean now I'm like, oh, let me try to get this stereo in my bag before I leave the store? No, right? Because it's unintentional. I think where the danger lies is if you're making a conscious choice to, let's see if I can slip this by. Because once that starts to happen, that goes from $1 to $10 to 100 to 100 million, right? Really, really fast. And you rationalize, as you said, Nelson, it becomes something that, humans are very good at creating story because that's how we bond. That's how we find meaning in the world, but it's also to justify our behavior. And then again, depending on what religion you grew up with, does that justification work or not? Sometimes it's, just ask for forgiveness and there's no problem, right? So a lot of people will have different lenses of how they're operating. And that's why you get these people misappropriating funds or not caring about the small things, which leads into big things because they see it happening. And then someone in a different position without as much information or as much power to make decisions witnesses that act and has a very different interpretation of what's happening.
Before I say your list, Scott, someone pointed out to me that rationalize can be broken up into rational lies. And I think it's a nice little soundbite because that's exactly what we do. We tell ourselves stories, as you said, sir. And if it can start with something that is unintentional. And because I got away with it, or because I discovered, oh, that didn't turn out bad, now I may be prone to making it more conscious the next time. The slippery slope is always a danger. It doesn't mean we're always going to go down it, but it is always there. And then to another angle that Scott, that you addressed and JC responded to is there's the effect on society, there's effect on the structure of society, and there's the effect on us. And those may operate independent of one another. Because when I indulge certain behaviors in myself, that's going to lead to similar behavior. There may ultimately be fallout to society, or there may not, or vice versa. But balancing both of those elements seems to be essential in making ethical decisions. So, Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, JC, you said my position was absolutist. You're doggone right it was. Because when it comes to how we monitor our behavior in terms of the expectations that your homeboy here sets up for himself, absolutism is the only thing worth aspiring to when it comes to ethics. Now, I can admit I made a mistake. I can have a oops moment, but to say that that oops moment is anything other than the lack of ethical behavior that it is to me setting a standard lower for myself than is unacceptable, and it keeps me unincentivized to continue to aspire high. And so I will argue when it comes to ethics, the lack of absolutism when it comes to how we assess our behaviors has led us down roads to disaster. By the way, oops moments may or may not have consequences that we can't even imagine. Oops, I called a person I perceived as homosexual the F word that day. I shouldn't have done it. Well, you find out 3 days later that they had self-hate issues and they killed themselves. These lapses are serious and have serious implications, whether they have certain outcomes or not. Now, that doesn't mean we judge ourselves as evil people and damn ourselves to hell because we have small ethical lapses. I agree that self-flagellation over issues that have small impact is inappropriate. That's part of being human, and accepting that going up and down the moral ladder is a part of being human, I feel is a part of a mature approach to how we wrestle with the grays of ethics in our lives. Number two, Sarah, you pointed on something which is that culturally, what may be deemed ethical or not is dependent upon a whole host of traditions, including the religious backgrounds of that particular culture. What are ethics except mores that a society agrees upon, govern, or a group of individuals agree governs them in a way that's acceptable or not? And what are societies except collections of individuals, all of whom agree to behave according to certain standards? And it goes then as to thinking in a democratic society, which I think the fact that we live in a democratic society is a huge, huge deal in this example, because that government is us. It's us, whether we like it or whether or not, it is us. And so irrespective, yes, that money might be misappropriated, but most democratic societies, including ours, have separate mechanisms for dealing with that. And the fact that someone else may misappropriate money has nothing to do with whether making the decision to not contribute to the fiscal health of that society at whatever level you, me, or anyone else feels is inappropriate. It's still stealing from the self, and it's stealing from the society. Absolutism is on target here. You make a mistake, you move on, you forgive the self. That's an ethical behavior too, at least in my opinion. But let's not acknowledge what's really happening here.
So I might argue that, there's a lot of philosophers that would disagree, like Thoreau, who would say that if you give your tax money to a government that you think is doing the wrong thing, you're absolutely ethically and morally reprehensible. So if your government supports slavery and you give money to that government, you are morally and ethically supporting an immoral act. So we can say that there's a couple of perspectives on that piece. The absolutism, where you're so, and I'm so now curious how you got so positive about. I have a quote in my second book that says, absolutism will destroy us absolutely. In that, in my experience, I've done some things that, large things that are morally and ethically reprehensible. And in one society, I was thought to be good, and in another society, I was thought to be bad. And it led my departure from Christianity into a philosophy that I felt could help me to make sense of the world. So if we had just gone with when we go with ethical absolutism, I think that what we're asking people to do, and personally, I think it's very egocentric. It means I'm right, and this is what right looks like. And if you're not, sorry, my phone only rings when it's my wife and she never calls. So I apologize for that. It's one thing I don't silence.
No worries.
But I think that what we have to do is, there's this thing called kindness that comes with ethics. And the Stoics were big believers in this. And I think they were very big on ethics. But they also felt that we had to be kind to ourselves and we had to be kind to others. And we had to look at incidents, not just collectively, but as individual incidents. And I think that's really important for other things, because as we go down this path, if we reflect this absolutism on others, there's a lot of judgment going on. And I got to be honest with you, maybe this is just my problem. And I can be wrong, Scott. I'm really good being wrong. But maybe I'm so worried about being judged for the unethical things that I feel I've done, that I'm very, very, I don't want to judge others on their behavior. And I certainly don't want to put an absolute label on anything they do.
When I hear Scott talk about absolutism, what I hear is having a clear set of ethical standards for myself and being fully committed to those standards, with the recognition that I'm not always going to meet them. And the very title of this show, Grappling the Great, is because too often, those principles may be in conflict with one another. Duty to country, duty to abstract justice. Those are not always going to go together, and frequently they don't. And then we have to choose. We have to make, we have to prioritize. And that means we're sacrificing one ethical principle for another. But I don't hear that being in conflict to Scott's idea of moral or ethical absolutism. I do think there is this, and I mentioned this many times, this insidious phrase, situational ethics, which is used to describe how ethics change in situations. And I think that is dangerous and wrong. Situations change. which means the application of ethics will change, but those principles have to be hard and fast. Now, that being said, what both you, JC, and you, Sarah, said, that from culture to culture, ethical standards do change, and then we have different problems. What happens when two cultures clash? Before you give you go, Sarah, there's a comment here from Tanita. I'd love to hear what you guys think about how self-awareness ties into personal and socially perceived intention. Sarah, you can respond to that, or you can respond to the comments that have been already made. Take your pick.
I think that's a wonderful question. I think self-awareness is a huge part of it. And the average person will tell you that they're self-aware. And I highly doubt that they are, myself included. I like to think that I'm very self-aware, and I've definitely had to put my foot in my mouth a few times or go back later and realize just how unaware in that particular situation I was. So anyone on the personal growth path is already a step ahead, because we don't know what we don't know. And there's a lot of that, right? And maybe when you're 17, you think you know everything. And then every year after that, you start to learn just how much you don't know. But having self-awareness is how you communicate better. It's how you relate better, not only to people, but in yourself, but to concepts, to ideas such as ethics, right? And I think from what I hear, Scott saying, talking about absolutism, it's deciding that this is your set of principles and being radically honest with yourself, which involves self-awareness, to say, this is what I believe to be true. This is what I believe to be right. And I screwed up this time. And acknowledging that and accepting it, but then also moving on, having kindness in that situation, which we can do it for ourselves. We can extend that to other people. And yet at the same time, if we have a hard and fast rule that it's only black or white, we know that that's not how the world works. And there are many instances in which, an act is committed. And to your point, JC, in one side, it is celebrated, and another side, it is condemned. So whoever is deeming it to be right or wrong is usually the one in power. Victors write the history books. But absolutism is also why we've had so many wars, because it's this ideal that is true, but only to one group of people. So I really liked your point, Yonasan, about the situational ethics, right? Because again, that's where we start to justify and say, oh, well, because of this factor and this, it was okay. But really, what is a boundary? A boundary is not a hard and fast line in the sand. It is more like a membrane, like our skin, right? We can both sweat and release, and yet we have a barrier to prevent things from coming inside. And that moves like an amorphous membrane, like a jellyfish, if you will. And so depending on the situation, we might contract, we might expand, and there are core principles that we'll be holding, but it is not a black and white situation. So I think if we're talking about absolutes, having that for yourself, being clear on them is very important, and communicating them to others is also important, because otherwise assumptions get made. And we all know what happens when we do that. It's a nice little math equation. If you write out the word assume, right? You and I both look like something that's we don't want to see the light of day, right? And that's really where we start to get in trouble, because people make assumptions, they tell stories and justify, but we don't want to go on the other side and have this radical behavior of an absolute. If I don't do this, I'm bad. Then, because that's where we start to have other issues that we are very familiar with.
Yeah, I really like that image of boundaries of membrane. I think that's really beautiful. You just come up with that now, or have you been thinking about that for a while?
No, it's something I've been talking about for a while.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very, very useful image. Because something like peace is an absolute value, but sometimes you have to go to war.
Yeah.
And we prefer not to, and we look for every possible way not to. But peace has to come from two sides. And if only one party wants peace, it's not going to happen, no matter how much of a priority it may be. So having a certain amount of flexibility, but not limitless flexibility. Folks, we're just about at the end of our time. So gentlemen, if you want to get a couple of last licks in.
Look, I do feel that when it comes to assessing how we are behaving and making judgments upon the self around our behavior, it's important, at least from my perspective, even though I do believe in absolutes vis-a-vis ethical behavior when it comes to our personal aspirations, to be clear, there is also a hierarchy, an ethical hierarchy that we have to create within our mind that deals with some of these situations. But I have to also say, there are some ethical things that I do feel, and I will argue with anyone, I don't care how smart they are or what sort of reputation they have, are absolutes that need to be held as absolutes. For instance, child abuse. I will say that's absolutely ethically wrong. Slavery, I will say, is absolutely ethically wrong. And people who say, I think absolutes are bad. Well, good. Maybe we should put them in chains and have them be slaves and their children too, and see if they think absolutes are so bad. This has been an amazing conversation because a seemingly small thing has opened the door to some profound, passionate discussion. Thank you for this, Jonason.
And I was thinking that too, because some of the previous episodes we've handled really, really big issues. And I wanted to shift to something that was very micro. And I couldn't be more pleased. JC, you have any final thought before we wrap it up?
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually bring this up to people I talk to who are absolutists. I will tell you that I absolutely feel that pedophilia is wrong, but I know that there is a huge portion of the world that regularly practices that. And if I go in, and I've been in this position, and many of us have who have served overseas, we've been in the position where we've seen this. And in our culture, in our belief system, though I absolutely 100%, I believe it's wrong, I could have seriously damaged, and you watched individuals damage relationships with other countries where, see, it's absolute to us, but it's not absolute to everybody else. And if absolutes, and again, the pedophilia, we know it goes on. We've seen, I've seen it openly displayed in certain countries. We know that there's slavery. And if we're going to hold that high ethical standard and say this is wrong for everybody, I don't know that, I could get behind that, maybe, but I'm imposing my will and my standards on everybody else. And if we want to talk slippery slopes, where does that end? Because now it gets scary.
Well, in fact, that's a topic for another day, but it really is one that we should address, and it's something that I struggle with a lot, because you mentioned again, Sarah, that the Asian countries, we do a tremendous amount of trade with China, and yet we find tremendous fault with China for many of their policies and their behaviors. So on the one hand, if I'm an absolutist, shouldn't I say I will not deal with a country that has human rights abuses?
Not necessarily.
Well, it's not that simple. It's not that simple.
But that's the ethical, to me, that's the ethical hierarchy in action.
Yeah. And so, these things can get very thorny when we get into these types of issues. And that's not a problem we're going to solve today, but thank you. This has been a really, really stimulating and engaging conversation. And I thank all of you, JC Click, Sarah Calmetta, and Scott Mason. Thank you. And you will be hearing from me again before too long. For those of you who are watching and listening, if you have an ethical dilemma or scenario you'd like us to take up, please go to jonasongoldson.com. Use the contact information, submit it, and if it's compelling, we will indeed take it up on a future episode. And until then, please continue to grapple with the gray.